Hi, my name's Katie Lumsden and I run a channel over on YouTube called Books and Things where I talk about books and various other things. And one of my favourite kinds of books to talk about is Victorian literature. I am a huge Victorian literature fan and my favourite author of all time is Charles Dickens. I think he's absolutely incredible. So today I'm going to be talking to you about 6 chapters from David Copperfield, which is a fantastic novel full of so many wonderful characters and such fascinating plots. I also think it's a fantastic place to start with Dickens, so if this is your first Dickens, hopefully it'll lead you on to some more Dickens books in the future. So the chapters I'm going to be talking about today are from sort of coming up to the middle of the book. In chapter 25, Good and Bad Angels, David Copperfield meets up with Traddles again, who he hasn't seen for a long time, and he also once more sees Uriah Heep, who confesses to David that he is in love with Agnes, much to David's disgust. In chapter 26, I Fall into Captivity, David Copperfield meets Dora for the first time and is completely and utterly smitten with her. In chapter 27, Tommy Traddles, David goes round to visit Tommy Traddles and finds that Traddles is in fact lodging with the Micawbers, who he hasn't seen for a long time. In chapter 28, Mr. Micawber's Gauntlet, David invites Mr. Traddles and the Micawbers round for dinner. The dinner party goes slightly wrong and Littimer turns up at one point, slightly oddly asking where Steerforth is, and then Steerforth himself turns up at the very end of the chapter and becomes clear that he's been spending a little more time in Yarmouth than David perhaps expected. In chapter 29, I visit Steerforth at his home again. David, as the chapter title would suggest, visits Steerforth in his home again, and we have a slightly dramatic scene between Steerforth and Rosa Dartle. In chapter 30, A Loss, David goes to Yarmouth, having heard that Barkis, Peggotty's husband, is ill, and while there, Barkis finally passes away. And then in chapter 31, A Greater Loss, something even more dramatic happens, and Emily, David's childhood friend, who is about to marry Ham, Peggotty's nephew, leaves her family, runs away into the night with no other than Steerforth. So there is a lot happening in these 6 chapters, but there are 2 things that I want to focus on particularly. One is the moment where David first meets Dora and how his kind of love for her grows, because I think it's a real prime example of Dickens's kind of comic writing, but also comic writing about something which we do as readers take seriously, which I think is quite fun. And then I also want to talk about Emily and Steerforth at the end of this section, because this is a really dramatic moment in the book, and it's also a dramatic moment in terms of David's relationships and friendships and him realising that his judgment perhaps isn't always quite sound. And here is the moment where David meets Dora Spenlow for the first time. We went into the house, which was cheerfully lighted up, and into a hall where there were all sorts of hats, caps, greatcoats, plaids, gloves, whips and walking sticks. "Where is Miss Dora?" said Mr. Spenlow to the servant. Dora, I thought. What a beautiful name. We turned into a room near at hand. I think it was identical to the breakfast room made memorable by the brown East India sherry, and I heard a voice say, "Mr. Copperfield, my daughter Dora and my daughter Dora's confidential friend." It was, no doubt, Mrs. Spenlow's voice, but I didn't know it, and I didn't care whose it was. All was over in a moment. I had fulfilled my destiny. I was a captive and a slave. I loved Dora Spenlow to distraction. She was more than human to me. She was a fairy, a sylph. I don't know what she was. Anything that no one ever saw and everything that everybody ever wanted. I was swallowed up in an abyss of love in an instant. There was no pausing on the brink, no looking down or looking back. I was gone headlong before I had sense to say a word to her. And then a few pages on, I don't remember who was there except Dora. I have not the least idea what we had for dinner besides Dora. My impression is that I dined off Dora entirely and sent away half a dozen plates untouched. And even a couple of chapters later, at the beginning of chapter 28, until the day arrived on which I was to entertain my newly found old friends, I lived principally upon Dora and coffee. Now, I want to talk a little bit about David's love for Dora, because I think it's well done and very entertaining, and I think it shows one of Dickens's strengths very much. It is very, very funny. David's passion for Dora, which is complete and utter love at first sight, but sort of complete infatuation, really over the top, is really, really entertaining. But we also do realise that he does really like this young woman, and that this is the first time we see David properly in love in earnest. He has kind of been in love a little bit in the past. We know of his kind of childhood affection for Emily, and a young woman who he sort of liked a bit when he was at school. But this is the first time that we see him falling in love as an adult, and that does make a difference. And while he is still quite young and his reaction to falling in love is quite childish and the way he thinks about it is still quite naive, I also think you do get a sense of the strength of of this and that it is more. On the one hand, David says that he doesn't have many more designs on Dora than he did on Emily when they were children together, but at the same time, when he's having breakfast with Dora and her father the next day, he's kind of imagining her father giving them blessing on their engagement and starting to think kind of more seriously about love as an adult. But at the same time, we do see Dickens's humour at its best, and Dickens kind of having a little bit of a laugh at David Copperfield's expense at how kind of exuberant his love is. But if we contrast the chapter where David first meets Dora and how it is both important for the plot and serious for David, but also very, very comical, that's very different to the later sections of these chapters when David goes to Yarmouth and we have Barkis's death and Emily running away with Steerforth, and suddenly we go right from the comic to the immediately serious. And one of the things I think Dickens does so fantastically in his novels is have that balance between the lightness and the darkness, between humour and tragedy, because what happens in chapter 30 and 31 is two tragedies. First we have Barkis's death, which is a great blow to all of them, and especially to Peggotty, who has had a good marriage despite the slightly odd beginning that it had earlier on in the book. And then we have Emily running away with Steerforth when she was due to marry Ham, which is a very important and interesting part of the book. It's worth saying as well, for those of you who aren't necessarily as familiar with the Victorian period and its kind of cultural and social history, for Emily, an unmarried woman, to run away with an unmarried man would be an incredibly, incredibly serious thing that would ruin her reputation and tarnish her life forever. And she also considered herself, and is considered in many ways, lost to her family. She writes that she is never going to return home again unless Steerforth marries her and brings her back a lady. But her uncle immediately wants to go out and find her and try and bring her back if possible. But that is not what Emily thinks. Emily is kind of aware that by leaving her family in this way, that by leaving the man she's engaged to go and run off with Steerforth, she is throwing away the life she has previously had. And this is what she writes. When you who love me so much better than I ever have deserved, even when my mind was innocent, see this, I shall be far away. When I leave my dear home, oh my dear home, in the morning, it will be never to come back unless he brings me back a lady. This will be found at night, many hours after, instead of me. Oh, if you knew how my heart is torn, if even you that I have wronged so much that never can forgive me, could only know what I suffer. I am too wicked to write about myself. Oh, take comfort in thinking that I am so bad. Oh, for mercy's sake, tell my uncle that I never loved him half so dear as now. Only don't remember how affectionate and kind you have all been to me. Don't remember we were ever to be married, and try to think as if I died when I was little and was buried somewhere. Pray heaven that I am going away from have compassion on my uncle. Tell him that I have never loved him half so dear. Be his comfort. Love some good girl that will be what I was once to uncle, and be true to you, and worthy of you, and know no shame but me. God bless all. I'll pray for all often on my knees. If you don't bring me back a lady and I don't pray for my own self, I'll pray for all. My parting love to uncle, my last tears, my last thanks for uncle. This is all Emily leaves behind her on leaving her family, and this is how she says goodbye. And I think there are a few things to notice in sort of exploring why Emily leaves and why she runs away with Steerforth. And I think partly is because she is attracted by Steerforth, she is swept away by Steerforth, and they have been having a love affair of some kind, and she has finally been pushed to the point where she decides that she will run away with him. And partly it's because she doesn't want to marry Ham, because she is very fond of this boy who she's known all her life, but we've never got the impression that she loves him as much as he loves her. And it's partly as well to do with class. Emily from a young age has kind of wanted to be a lady, and the life she would have with Ham is not the life of a lady, and then she meets this gentleman who is attractive and upper class and fashionable and all these things that she has never been able to aspire to, and that is partly why Emily ended up kind of succumbing and running off with Steerforth. It's interesting as well to note that both Emily and Steerforth believe they are doing wrong. Emily writes that she has been wicked, that she knows that this is wrong, that she has been loved by her family more than she deserves. And Steerforth too, the last time he sees David, says, "Daisy, if anything should ever separate us, you must think of me at my best, old boy. Come, let us make that bargain. Think of me at my best if circumstances should ever part us." He knows that he is about to take a step that David can never forgive him for, and therefore he kind of begs David's forgiveness in advance. I think it's worth considering how David feels about this, and how difficult it is for David to know that if he had never introduced Steerforth to this family, none of this would have ever happened. He feels in many ways responsible, both for bringing Steerforth to them, but also for having judged Steerforth wrongly, for not having understood that Steerforth was perhaps not so good and moral a man as David David had often thought that perhaps he was not so praiseworthy, and that just because Steerforth is likeable and charismatic doesn't mean he is good. Agnes has warned David about this before, but David has always ignored her, and it's now really that David realises that Agnes was right and he was wrong. When I heard him crying, the impulse that had been upon me to go down upon my knees and ask their pardon for the desolation I had caused and curse Steerforth yielded to a better feeling. My overcharged heart found the same relief, and I cried too. And I think that's all I wanted to say today about those 6 chapters. I find it really interesting to note how Dickens balances the shade and the light within his works, how he balances humour and darkness, and how he kind of has more comical scenes leading up to the more serious ones in his books to kind of make the impact of them felt all the more. And I think that's all I have to say for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you continue to enjoy the rest of David Copperfield.